Hello, my name's Roisin and welcome back to my channel. You may notice we are somewhere else. I am at my mum's house right now, but I wanted to introduce this vlog. This video is the second part in my Reading Around the World challenge. I will link the video that explains what this is. Actually, I will link the playlist for my Read Around the World challenge up here, which includes the video that explains what this is and my first video, which was reading books from Southern Africa. So this month I pulled out from my jar, well, I'll show you what I pulled out from my jar. So let's get on with it. This is my second attempt at this Regions jar because if you watch my last TBR, you'll know that water got into my Regions jar and washed all the paper clear of the countries. So we're trying again. Hopefully that won't happen this time. So I have got Aboriginal, Maori and Torres Strait Islander. So there you go. I've pulled out Maori, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander books to read this month. Books by Maori, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander writers. And as always, I will leave in the description the link to my Google Sheets where I have compiled all of the books that I found that were by Aboriginal, Maori and Torres Strait Islander writers. I found finding Maori writers that were published in England, in the UK, like accessible to me, much harder to find than Aboriginal writers. But there is a book called Aue, which is coming out later in the year that I definitely want to read. So I'm looking forward to when that comes out. But the books that I have decided to read, so I'm going to read 2 Maori and 3 Aboriginal books by Aboriginal authors. And I also couldn't find any books by Torres Strait Islanders that are published in the UK. So the first book I'm planning to read is Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia. These Growing Up in Australia series is quite well known. I've definitely seen Mercedes from Mercy's Bookish Musings read this one, so I'm going to read that, and that is a collection of essays, and the title kind of explains what it's about. It is about different people who are growing up Aboriginal, who are Aboriginal people who grew up in Australia, and it's different experiences. So I imagine it will be quite a broad range, but it is good, I think, to read some non-fiction alongside the fiction I will be reading. I'm also going to read The Yield by Tara June Winch, which was one of my most anticipated releases last year, and then it didn't actually end up coming out because of the pandemic until January. So very excited to read that. So The Yield is about Poppy Gondawindi, who has been writing a dictionary of Gujarati words. That is the nation that he comes from, and he has just passed away, and his granddaughter August has come back home. She's been away in the UK for years because of the tragedy that happened, and she's come back home, and their house is under threat from a local mining company that wants to start a tin mine, and she wants to try and save the house, and she's also looking for this dictionary. So the dictionary has words and stories from Poppy's life growing up, and so we go through those two different timelines. We go through those two different timelines. And I'm also planning to read the Swan book by Alexis, Wright. This is a book about Oblivia Ethylene, I believe, in a dystopian Australia with Aboriginals still living under the intervention in the north of the company. It's about a young woman who lives in a swamp filled with rusting boats and thousands of black swans and ends up married to Warren Finch, the first Aboriginal president of Australia, where she is confined to a tower in a flooded and lawless southern city. This one I think is quite experimental, so yeah, I'm going to read that. Then in terms of Maori books, I am going to read The Parihaka Woman by Witi Ihimaera, who is quite a famous Kiwi Maori author who wrote The Whale Rider, which I know was made into a film. And this one is a historical fiction, which is why I decided to read this, about Parihaka, which was a non-violent revolt against the British incursion in New Zealand, trying to take their land, and they did non-violent resistance, which apparently inspired Gandhi. So I'm going to read that one, and then I'm also planning to read Potiki, which is another book about Indigenous people losing their land, which I suppose is kind of the theme of being an Indigenous person in any colonised land. This one is about a group, a Maori family, who a company wants to buy their land because it's right on the seafront, and they want to set up a resort there, and this family don't want to sell their land, they want to keep their land that they have. It's their their native land. There is a specific word for that, and I cannot remember the word for it, but they want to keep hold of it, and they're refusing to sell, and it's about the conflict between them and this company that wants to build. So those are the books I'm going to read this month, so I will do the vlog and see you back here at the end. Hello! So it's the day of the Euros final and I'm off to the pub, so I've got to be quick, but a hair in my mouth. I've started both the Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia and the Parihaka Woman. I am about fifth of the way through both of them, so I've come in to talk to you. Now, Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia is a collection of essays written by different authors, so of course some of them are going to be more my style than others. I feel like they started with a couple of weak ones and it's actually getting better as it goes on. Some of the tales are more about things that you would associate with being Aboriginal, things like the stolen generation, for example. There was one on that which I thought was quite powerful. Some of them are about people pretending to not be Aboriginal in order to avoid the racism of that, and some of it's about about Aboriginal family and Aboriginal family structures, and some of them are just growing up. And I think that's like, obviously the fact that I've only read about 6 or 7 essays so far and they've all been so diverse and different, I think is what's good about a collection like this. But some of them are much weaker in terms of the writing than the others, so I'm not enjoying them as much. I'm like bookmarking my favourites because I'm reading them in the ebook on Scribd, and you can like fold over the corner digitally, so I'm bookmarking my favourites, so I will tell you what my favourites are in the future. And there are definitely some writers that I'm going to go and look up later and potentially add to future TBRs of things I want to read, which is another great thing about reading essay collections like this, is that you can find writers that you might not have heard of otherwise as a way into them. The Parihaka Woman is a novel based on a historical event, and it's split between 2 perspectives. So one of the perspectives is this history teacher from the 1960s who's saying that he's discovered this he's translating this like first-person account of the 19th century in this Maori settlement. So it begins with this bombardment in the 1840s, I believe, by the British of this Maori town where they razed everything, and then the people go on sort of a escape from it and they are wandering around. There's a lot of Christian metaphors, so it's like the Israelites wandering in the desert, although that is also a Jewish metaphor, but the focus here is on the Bible. And then they found this new settlement that is peaceful and uses peaceful resistance in order to fight the British, and it's kind of based on that story of peaceful resistance. So far, the stuff from the history teacher's perspective is a lot real history, like he's quoting from sources and things like that, which I think is an interesting way to tell this tale, although it's hard to get engaged entirely with that perspective. It feels very kind of cold and not a lot of character. The other perspective I find a little easier to get into, although still the writing's not my favourite style at the moment. Obviously I'm going to persevere with both of these, none of them are annoying me enough to give up yet, but for now, neither of these are my favourites. The ones that I'm kind of anticipating being my favourites are the Swan book and the Yield anyway, so I didn't necessarily know whether these 2 were going to be my style. I don't know much about Witi Ihimaera, who wrote the Parihaka Woman, except that he wrote the White Whale Rider, and I knew that being a collection of essays told from multiple different perspectives, the Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia was going to go this way because that's what tends to happen, but I'm enjoying it nonetheless. So I am now halfway through both Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia and the Parihaka Woman. And Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia is going the same way as I said when I was like a quarter of the way in, which is to be expected because it's a series of essays. I have had more that I've enjoyed as we've got towards the halfway point than I did the first few. I felt there's some that are stronger. I would say that generally speaking, it's more about the story than about the writing. Not everyone in here has a style of writing that I necessarily vibe with. It's all, not all of it, but quite a lot of them are very simplistic in the style of writing. There are some that are really well written, and again, I should have looked up which ones I liked before I came on here, but I promise when I do the wrap up I will write down my favourites so I can tell you which ones I really liked. I'm learning stuff though that I didn't know. I knew about the stolen generation. I know that that's kind of a common experience across different colonised nations. Like I know that there is a stolen generation in Canada and in the USA as well as in Australia, of people who were forcibly adopted. So, but I'm learning about things like the missions and the treatment of people there, and this sort of like hiring out of Aboriginal children to do work, like people taking them away for a holiday and just making them do work, which sounds horrible. But a lot of it's more about people who are now in their 30s and 40s and 50s, so whose parents were in the stolen generation perhaps, rather than who were part of it themselves, although that did continue for longer. But a lot of these people, it's more of their parents' story. And so they're just talking about their experience growing up. Most of the people are part Aboriginal and have some European ancestry too, which again is a common experience, I think, because of, you know, forced assimilation, etc., and because of genocide, meaning there aren't that many people. So that's not exactly a surprise, but I feel like there has been some repetition of themes, which I guess is what you expect to get, but I feel like I've heard a lot about the not feeling fully one or the other, which I understand is how these people are feeling. I just feel like that editing could have maybe spread those further apart or looked at different perspectives on it, rather than some of these feel very much the same story, which I suppose through repetition works to show you how common this story is across Australia. But I feel like because some of them aren't so skillful in the writing and then also are saying the same things as some of the other stories, it feels a bit redundant occasionally, but that's more about the editing and how it was put together than the actual stories themselves. Then I'm also halfway through the Parihaka woman. The plot has started to pick up now. There's kind of an adventure quest, like a terrible one going on, but it's not my favourite book. The style of the writing, it's really like I'm learning about the Maori history and about the history of, again, the genocide of the Maori people, the breaking of treaties and all that sort of thing, alongside the 1960s March for Maori rights. And that's a very much more small part, because the way the story is constructed is there is this history teacher who is a Maori history teacher in the 1970s, I think, talking about his experience of becoming politicised and also his translation of this text by a Parihaka woman about Parihaka and what happened there. But it does often feel like it's very interesting but quite dry, and it's like reading a history rather than reading a narrative a lot of the time, and not reading narrative history. Like it's just quite dry in the way that it's written, in that like it doesn't really explore the psychology of characters, which is what I like when I'm reading books. I like books that kind of go in depth into character psychology, and I feel like this is much more events focused, and so whilst I always enjoy reading historical fiction to learn about things that I don't know about, I kind of want to be more immersed in a character, and also I love description to feel the surroundings, and I feel like I don't get that with this. I feel like there is a lot of description of traditional Maori ways of life, but in a way that feels like anthropological, historical, rather than that feels native to the characters. I don't know how to describe what I mean. It doesn't feel integrated fully. It feels like, and this would be this, and this would be that. Also, there's a bit of a weirdness about like pronouns, which is not as in he, she, they, but as in there's this bit, the bits that are translated often say Eanora, which is the name of the character who wrote this historical bit. They often say I, and then also say Eanora a few sentences later, and I don't know if it's common in Maori to speak about yourself in the third person, and maybe that's why that stylistic choice has been made, or if the voice is just a bit confused, and it doesn't help that I'm listening to the audiobook in which both of those sections are used in the same voice actor, so she always just sounds like she's talking about herself in the third person all the time. And then the other thing is that the characters feel very flat and one-dimensional. Like, I have no doubt about the terrible things the British did in New Zealand, and I have no doubt that some of the things that are being said actually happened. What I do struggle with a little bit is a character sitting in a dark room looking at his own scarred face in a mirror and manically laughing like some sort of Disney villain. Like, it doesn't feel very deep or true to life of a character. It feels like it just feels really shallow, and I'm not saying that I have to be able to empathise with them, but like when I read The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr., we get things from the perspective of these slave-owning people, a father, a mother and a son, and we see how all of them interact differently with the enslaved people and have a different perspective on it, but how they justify it to themselves. They feel like real rounded characters, but you never once sympathise with them. They always seem terrible, like everything they do is terrible, but you can see how they're explaining it to themselves. It allows you to understand them without empathizing with them, and this maniacal laughing into a mirror character just feels like a pantomime villain, a bit Phantom of the Opera rather than real and true to life. So yeah, I'm not loving it. at the moment, unfortunately, but I am looking forward to, I think I'm going to start the Swan book today, so I'm looking forward to that as well. Hello, I look slightly worse for wear. It is Sunday and it is super hot today, and I know it's 33 degrees and it's got a the humidity of like 53%. Turns out the weather in Hertfordshire today is the same as the weather in Kuala Lumpur, which is fun, especially because we have, you know, houses built for retaining heat and no air conditioning. And I know Australia, if any of you are from Australia, 33 degrees is not hot, but my cousins who live in Perth think that 12 degrees is cold in the winter, so we'll talk then. And Canada, I know you win. You win at weather. You have it all. Anyway, I'm talking about books. I finished 2 books now. I finished The Parihaka Woman this morning. Didn't love it. The last third got a lot better. Ironically, when it got a lot plottier, which is not normally my thing. But because this book had kind of underdeveloped characters and really simplistic writing, kind of needed plot to give it any sort of oomph. And when our main character got going on her like quest and lost her sisters, not lost her sisters, but sent her sisters back home and went on the quest by herself, that turned into a more interesting story. But overall, not 100% my favourite. There was a bit that, as I think I said before, it was split between 2 narratives, one of a Maori woman in the middle to late 19th century, and one a history teacher in the 1960s. And the history teacher, it felt very like randomly throwing in facts that didn't really, I guess because Eleanor couldn't have known them, so, but Ihimaera thought that it was necessary to have them in the story, but for me it did feel unnecessary and kind of didactic and boring. Overall, I think that's my main problem. The writing didn't sing, and even some of the critiques that I brought up, for example, the like sheer Disney villain level of villainy in his villain, how many times can I say the word villain, he brought up saying, oh, my wife said this, and it was like, well, actually he was worse than I wrote. And I'm like, yeah, I believe that he did worse things than you wrote, but you wrote him cackling at himself in a mirror. Like, it just didn't really work for me. And that situation, I prefer more character-focused books. I prefer books with beautiful writing, and this didn't have either of those things. I don't know if he's not for me as a writer, because I've looked up some of the reviews after I finished reading it as well, and he didn't get very good reviews, and apparently had been accused of plagiarism with his previous historical fiction, which is why he's so, like, citing his sources and, like, these are historical facts, I'm not plagiarising things, in this one. Sorry, I've just got something in my eye. I don't know if I would read any more of his other books. Perhaps The Whale Rider is better. If any of you are from New Zealand or are familiar with Witi Ihimaera, then let me know if any of his other books are worth reading. I just didn't really enjoy The Parihaka Woman. I enjoyed the like history aspect of it and like learning the history, but this felt like such a dry history book and also didn't feel like a novel. It felt very much like it was giving me a lot of facts about Parihaka, which is cool, really interesting place. Parihaka apparently inspired Gandhi with peaceful protest and things like that. Yeah, which was really interesting. But as I said, the writing, just not for me. Then I also finished Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia, and they definitely kept some of their best writers, some of the best essays to the second half. It definitely picked up, and I enjoyed a lot more in the second half than I did in the first half, although again some were misses for me, and like I said before, there was a lot of repetition, which I guess, I mean, each individual person telling their story and talking about feeling not fully Aboriginal and not fully white, and feeling confused in the middle, it's valid, it's their story. I'm not sure if more than half of the stories in here needed to tell that story. Maybe that's being a bit harsh, but I'm just not sure that it 100% worked for me. What I did find is that a lot of this was about like the experience of growing up Aboriginal post 1960-ish. There were some that were before that, but only 1 or 2. The vast majority were second half of the 20th century and 21st century growing up Aboriginal, which was interesting to learn, and there were lots of really good poignant stories in here. But I think I would also like to read a non-fiction history, narrative history about Aboriginal pre-colonialism and during the early colonial period as well, because I think I am like unaware of the history of missions and everyone being moved onto a mission. I feel like a mission in Australia is similar to a reservation in the US and Canada. That's the kind of vibe I'm getting, where people were moved off their traditional lands and into this specific space that they were not allowed to leave, and there were curfews and things like that. But as I say, I would like to learn more about like the history of it, which is not what this was for. This was specifically Aboriginal people telling their own experience of growing up in Australia. I mentioned before that I would tell you the ones that I'd saved, the ones that I really liked, and the writers that I'm going to be looking up. One was Tara June Winch, who I didn't realise had a story in here, and I am reading her book, The Yield, in this vlog, so that will be coming up. I'll be talking to you about that in a bit, but that was good. The other ones I liked were Tony Birch. Why does Google always think I am a robot? Can anyone explain why Google thinks I'm a robot all the time? Tony Birch is an Indigenous author who has written fiction, it looks like, as well as an activist, and I liked his one. Also, I also enjoyed Don Bermose's one. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that name correctly, but he is a musician. I'm not a robot, I'm just a Googler. John Hartley, I really enjoyed his one. Amberlynn Molina, who is also a novelist. Jack Asmore, who is a journalist. Amy McQuire, who is also a journalist. Todd Phillips, who is an educator. William Russell, who is a poet. Marley Silver, who is an activist and podcaster. Although her podcast is about sport in Australia, so I don't think I'm going to be listening to that. I don't listen to any sports podcasts about the UK or anything, so I doubt I'm going to listen to her podcast, sorry. And Liza Mayer Cyron, not a bloody robot, who is also a professor at a university. So I think generally speaking, the ones who do more writing are the ones that worked for me personally best, because I like the style of the writing, I suppose, and the way they formatted their story. And then I am also about 50 pages into the Swan book by Alexis Wright, and it took me a minute to get into. The writing is quite different from anything I've read for a while, very kind of literary and experimental, no dialogue, that sort of thing, and kind of a bit weird, and I think that's on purpose because it's set in a world where like climate change has ravaged everything and everyone. Sea levels have risen and people are all refugees, and there's dust all over Australia, and it's set in a small Aboriginal community, although there is one white woman who has made her way there, and these Aboriginal people are kind of imprisoned. They're in an army camp, and they can't really get out, and so far I'm really, really enjoying it. It's kind of got a mystical, magical kind of vibe to it, overtone, in terms of the writing. And I think the writing is beautiful. Like, I'm only 50 pages in and I think the writing is so stunning. I think there's going to be more plot that happens because the synopsis has so much more plot in it. Yeah, the first Aboriginal president of Australia. So I think there's going to be a lot that happens, but I'm not sure if it's going to feel like a really plotty book, because so far the writing has been really like the writing has been really beautiful and kind of dreamlike and unusual, and as I said, there's been no dialogue. Stuff's been happening, but it's just felt so sort of floaty, is the best way that I can describe it. But as I said, I'm only 50 pages in, so there's still a lot more to go, so I will update you when I get a little further into this. Hello, it is the hottest day of the year. I'm pretty sure I said that in the last clip, but I'm also pretty sure today is hotter. I have just got home from work. I just cycled home, which is why my bike is still in the living room, because it's too damn hot. I couldn't be bothered to take it outside. Although I know I am dishevelled. I am sweaty and dishevelled, but I look more sweaty and dishevelled than I am because I just splashed my face with an entire basin of cold water. But that is also why I have an ice cream and a beer. It's just necessary today. It's so hot. So I have got through some more books. That's why I'm talking to you, isn't it? Not because of not just to complain about the heat. Sorry, I won't talk with my mouth full. It really grosses me out when people do that. I have read 20% of Potiki. I'm going to put the name here and I'm going to endeavour to say it right in the future, but right now my brain is fried. So I've got through 20% of that, and I'm enjoying it so far. This is the other Maori book. It was published in 1987. But I'm not sure when it's set. It's definitely 20th century, there are trains and things, but I'm not sure if it's historical fiction from 1987 or if it's just set in 1987. But I'm enjoying it so far. It's jumping between time periods, and the beginning was very like folkloric introduction, but then the rest of it so far hasn't been like that. It's been jumping back and forth. There's been a death in the family, and a woman who's been away has returned, not because of the death, but she's discovered about the death, and that's why she returned. And then in the future, there is a woman, the same woman, and her husband and her children, and she's telling us about her children. And yeah, so far I'm really enjoying the writing style. As I said at the beginning, it was folkloric. Now it's not like that anymore, but it's got poetry in the writing, which I really love. So far it's been quite slow moving and very character focused, again, which I love. It feels like it's going to be a family drama, I think, but it's also involving people buying up the land for tourism from the Indigenous people. I only know that though from the blurb, because that's not in the actual part of the story yet. So then the other thing that I've been reading is The Yield by Tara June Winch, which interestingly covers a lot of the same topics and themes. So it's again split perspective, but this time it's not the same person in the past and in the present. It's Poppy, who is the grandfather, and August, who is the granddaughter, and it's split between when Poppy knew he was dying, but he's also talking about his past. He's writing this dictionary of Gujarati words, so that they will be carried on into the future, but he's also talking about the past and what it was like for him growing up Aboriginal in Australia through the use of these words, through the words that he's preserving. And then in the future, or in the present, August has gone back because Poppy has died, and she's gone back for his funeral, and it's talking a bit about her childhood, and also about the tin miners who are trying to buy up the land, or who have bought the land because it was relinquished by the Crown only for 99 years or something like that. So similar themes, and again, I'm really enjoying this. This is probably, The Yield is probably the most readable out of all of the books that I've read so far, but I don't mean that as an insult or to say that it's easy. It isn't. It's beautiful as well, beautifully written, but also readable at the same time, and I always think it's really impressive when writers can do that. It's got some really incredibly beautiful turns of phrase that I have really enjoyed, but at the same time it feels really compelling and I really want to keep reading it. So it's walking that line really well, which is good. So I feel like so far these three books that I'm reading right now, The Yield, Potiki, and the Swan book, are going to be my three favourites out of it. So that's good. That bodes well for the rest of this week. But right now I'm going to go and run myself a bath of just cold water and submerge. Okay, so I don't tend to vlog my life during these challenge videos so much. It's all about the books. But since I've been complaining about the weather so much, I thought maybe you can possibly hear my favourite weather has arrived, so I thought I would show you. I hope you appreciated those plinky rain shots, because I got completely drenched. So I am officially halfway through all three of the last three books. So first I'm going to talk to you about the Swan book by Alexis Wright. This is probably the weirdest of all the books that I'm reading. The writing style, it takes a lot of time to get to grips with, but once I get to grips with it, every time I restart reading it, every time I pick it up, I have to reread passages over again to kind of get myself into the rhythm of the book, because it's written in such an unusual way. But I really like it. The turns of phrase is really great. So this is set, I don't know if I've explained the intro what the story is, but it's set 100 years from now in Northern Australia, in a place that has been renamed Swan Lake. which is a swamp in northern Australia, where that has been like fenced in, and it's like a sort of internment camp for Aboriginal people, and from around the country they're being like shipped in and left there. And there is also a woman who has been a climate refugee, so climate change has altered the world, and there have been wars because of climate change. And this woman finds a girl in a tree who has been the victim of a gang rape, and that girl, called Olivia Etheline, is the main character in this book. But then there is also another character called Warren Finch, who is a boy who was raised in another Aboriginal nation nearby, but one that was allowed more freedom and more access, and he had a much different upbringing because they allowed themselves to be assimilated. And yeah, that's kind of where we are at the start of the book. I don't want to spoil anything that happens for you, but this book is, yeah, like I said, it's really strangely written. The Alexis Wright really has a strong way with language, like altering slightly the meaning of words, or using words that feel really surprising and in a really surprising way. That does take a little bit of getting used to, but once I'm in the flow of it, I can really understand the story. It's also it's science fiction, dystopian science fiction, because it's set in the future. And I've talked before on this channel how I don't really like dystopia, but this one is really working for me. And I think in part it's because of that writing style, which I think could be considered pretentious if you're not someone who likes an experimental writing style, but since I am, that works for me. And then also on top of that, it is also a political satire. It's definitely a funny book, the way that it talks about different characters. There's also elements of ghosts and magic, not real magic, but because our main character has been the victim of this really serious thing, really serious trauma, we begin with this surreal moment about a virus inside her brain, and then there are the two people who are important to her who passed away, who come back as ghosts. But how much is it ghosts and how much is it her mental health? But also it's a book about Aboriginal traditions and Aboriginal beliefs and things about elders and stuff like that. So I think there's a lot being woven in here. But despite myself not knowing a huge amount about any Aboriginal nations or Aboriginal culture before I started reading these books, I think that they are all accessible if you are like me and you're not a huge knower of those things. But this is definitely, I can see how, despite not being Australian or being au fait with the Australian government's treatment of Aboriginal people, I can see how this is really skewering how it's really a satire of the 200, 300 years of Australian government's poor treatment, obviously attempted genocide, and then poor treatment of Aboriginal people, and continued promises to do better and then not doing better, seeing themselves, the government in Canberra, as being knowing better how to really paternalistic treatment of Aboriginal people. And then it's also kind of skewering the Aboriginal people who go along with assimilation and who in order to get advantages for themselves go along with things that actually harm things altogether. It's also a story about telling stories, and there's a lot about storytelling, and obviously the Swan is a recurring theme, and interestingly, because the woman who is a refugee from the climate wars is loves to tell stories about swans and talks about swans a lot, and a lot of the tales of swans, white swans from the Northern Hemisphere. But in Australia there are black swans, so there is so Alexis Wright does really interesting things with that metaphor of the white swans and the black swans, and also of the storytelling and of swans, and of Dreamtime and Aboriginal relationships with the land. So I'm really enjoying that one, but it does take a minute for me to wrap my head around the writing style. The Yield by Winch I'm also really enjoying, and is much more accessible, much more easy for me to read in terms of the style. So this one has 3 different viewpoints. So the first one, we have August, whose grandfather has just died, and she lives in the US. She lives in England, but she's gone back to Australia for the funeral, and we know that her sister Jeddah went missing as a teenage girl, and also something happened to August that made her never want to stay where she was, in addition to this. But she has discovered on her return that her family are going to lose their land because of a mine, and so she's really she wants to try and sort of help them save their house and their land. And then also we have her grandfather, who was writing a dictionary, so stories of his life through those translations, through those words, and we see the ways that words don't the way that languages don't perfectly map onto one another, and also the political nature of words and the way that language shapes the way you view the world. And then the third perspective are letters from a German minister in 1915 about his experience setting up a mission for Aboriginal people, and the treatment of Aboriginal people and the abhorrence, the things that happened in the 19th and early 20th century. This one has a beautiful way with words, a beautiful turn of phrase, but is much slower and simpler, much more stripped back than the Swan book. So whilst it is still really beautiful and I'm really engaged with it, and I find the characters and their relationships particularly very strong in this book, it is more accessible and more easy to read than the Swan book. So whilst I feel like there's a lot of analysis that can happen for this, there is for this as well, but I think that this is definitely the more accessible of the two. Then I'm also halfway through Potiki by Patricia Grace, and that is the book about Maori people who whose land is attempted to be bought up by this company that wants to create tourism, and it's talked and while we were having really closely focused in on one family and building up their relationships, and again really beautiful, really sort of dreamlike writing that I'm really enjoying, but there was just a section about Teope, which is a town nearby where Maori people successfully protested by staying on their land to have some of their land, to maintain some of their ancestral land, and that bit did feel a bit like just a history lesson, didn't quite have the same beauty to it, but I'm really enjoying the story of the family, and again it's being told from multiple different perspectives, one of whom is this boy his is the perspective that feels quite dreamlike, whereas the others feel a bit more grounded, but I like the balance of both. So I'm going to finish all three of those books and get back to you, but I am so far really liking all three of them.
Remember when we were trying to...
Hello! So yes, the intro was filmed after I'd actually read all the books, but here I am. So the books I haven't talked to you about yet. I haven't talked to you about Potiki, which was by Patricia Grace, I believe. If I've got that name wrong, it will be on the screen. And this one I enjoyed the beginning more than when it got more plotty. So some of it's written from the perspective of one of the sons who is disabled, and his writing is very dreamlike, and I'm kind of a bit unsure if that's like miraculous disabled person writing. This is written from 1987, but yeah, I feel like I'm not sure how the representation of that was done, but some of the other but that was actually my favourite perspective in terms of the style of the writing, was just more my favourite style. Yeah, so when it started off and it was introducing everyone, introducing the culture, introducing the family, and the setup, I really enjoyed that part, and I enjoyed the like writing style that had a lot of beauty and a lot of like dreamlike qualities to it. But when it started to get more into the plot of this company and this trying to take over and the like horrible things that they did, it seemed very believable, but it got very like matter of fact, this happened and this happened. And then the ending I enjoyed as when it came back to more the like psychology and how it was affecting people. I enjoyed that, but the actual plot part felt a bit like a history lesson. There was a bit about Teope, which was a place nearby where something similar had happened, and where they managed to keep hold of their land. And then when it happened to them, it kind of, the more the plot happened, the further away we got from the characters and from that writing, and the more matter of fact it became. So I enjoyed it, but that aspect of it wasn't my favourite. Then I also finished the Swan book by Alexis, Wright, and I did enjoy this book for the most part. The like final third I enjoyed, and the beginning third I enjoyed. The middle third lost me a little bit. Again, got a bit more plotty, and I felt lost. But more than the plot losing me, what really lost me in this was the style of the writing. It took me a little while every time I picked up the book to get into it, because it's kind of experimental, a bit weird. Like some parts of it there's like internal brine, and I do enjoy that sort of thing, but I just feel like my brain, I'm not big brain enough for this book. This book felt like kind of beyond me. While it took me a while to get into every time, and that was a bit difficult, I feel like maybe I would need to listen to Alexis Wright talking about this book or read more around this book in order to like fully get it. I got some aspects of it, and some of the satire I thought was very well done, which is why in the previous clip when I've been talking about this I was really loving it, but yeah, it just felt sometimes a bit too confusing and didn't just quite work for me. I was very confused about what was going on, and it felt very like repetitive at times, so I got a bit lost. I did enjoy it, and I think that if I just sat down and read it, or if I'd listened to the audiobook, which was not available to me anywhere, like I couldn't even buy it, I would have enjoyed this more, and maybe I would enjoy it more on a second read. It's just really, really dense, and I would find myself having to reread paragraphs over and over again to like try and make sure my head was actually getting around it, and I would like drift off midway through a paragraph, and it's not because it was boring, but because it was really hard to keep hold of in some aspects of it. Yeah, it's a very weird book. The characters, I would say, aren't really fully developed characters, but that's not the point. It's much more a book of ideas than anything else, and beautiful writing. But sometimes that was just a bit too much for me, a bit too heavy on the denseness, and I struggled with this book. And I read a fair amount of like experimental fiction, and I enjoy books that are a bit weird and a bit dense and a bit challenging, but this was just a step too far for me personally, or at least in the way that I experienced it, the way that I read it. I think I'd have to like sit down and focus on this for a lot longer, for like a bigger chunks of time for me to really, really get to grips with this. And then I also finished The Yield, and I think that was probably my favourite book out of all of these 5 that I have read this month for this challenge. I cried. It was so moving. I feel like the reason I loved it the most was because it was a small cast of really well-developed characters. Like there was something terrible that happened to our main character August, and you know it's coming, and you kind of can work out what it is from quite long, but the point it happened, it still felt like a punch in the gut. There was a little bit of, later on in relation to like the tin mine and them trying to save the tin mine, there was a bit of over-explanatory language and a bit like melodramatic, like, oh my god, no. I don't know how to explain what I mean, but the language itself just felt a little cheesy, a little too on the nose for me in that very small section. But for the rest of it, I really enjoyed it. It was much more accessible than the Swan book, but it was still beautifully written, which is something I love. And yeah, again, I thought the characters were so well-rounded and so understandable. So their psychology was so fully developed, which is what I love in books. And then the other 2 that I read, I've already wrapped up for you, but Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia had some brilliant ones and some ones that I didn't get on with so much, because some of them were written by people who are professional writers and a lot of them weren't. So it's always going to be a bit hit and miss, but it definitely gave me some things to look up, and also some writers that I would like to spend some more time reading their work. And the Parihaka woman, the style of the writing really didn't work for me. It felt very simplistic, and so I didn't really love that one. But I am glad I read it because it was interesting to learn about the history. I definitely feel like I've barely touched the tip of the iceberg in terms of all of these writings. I've only read 2 books by Maori people and 3 books by Aboriginal authors. It's not a huge scope, and there's a lot more that I could read, but I feel like there are writers that I want to get to know now from this area. I think I would try another Alexis Wright book and see if any of them are more accessible for me, and I really, really definitely want to read more by Tara June Winch, as well as some of the writers in Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia, and I think it's something that I'm going to keep in my mind. Like I mentioned at the beginning, there's that book that's coming out by a Maori author whose name I will put on the screen. I cannot remember it off the top of my head right now. So I'm definitely going to keep up with reading these things. I think that so far I've had more success with reading the books from Southern Africa, but again, that's obviously just the books that I've picked rather than anything else. I'm glad I did this experience though. It's a history and a time period and a place in the world that I don't know very much about. So for me, this was a great like jumping off point, but I'm definitely going to read more, and I would recommend you read some of these books if any of them sound interesting to you. I'm sure lots of people love this book. It's got very, very high praise, but yeah, it just confused me. So come back again in at the end of September, and I will have read another region of the world. I'm definitely still enjoying doing this challenge, although of course I've only done 2 so far, so it's only just begun. If you did enjoy this video, I will put my vlog of reading Southern African fiction here, so you can go and check that out. And also, if you are not subscribed, I'll put a button here for you to subscribe and join us. I put out new videos 3 times a week, so I will see you again very, very soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.